Hi, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable on AI innovation in banks. For those of you who know us, welcome back. And for those of you who don't, I'm Alexandra Musavisadeh, co-founder of Evident, joined here by my co-founder, Annabelle Ailes. We produce the Evident AI Index, which is an annual ranking of the 50 largest banks in North America and Europe on their AI maturity. And throughout the year, we track the progress and AI activity across the banks. And today, we'll be looking at the results from the most recent data from the innovation pillar, which is one of the 4 pillars in our index. And we'll double click on the innovation sub-pillars, which are research, patents, ventures, and partnerships, and talk about what has changed, which banks to watch, and the emerging trends on how banks are reorganizing their innovation strategies to help drive outcomes from AI. And I'm delighted to be joined by 2 giants in this space, EJ Akner, head of the Office of Applied AI at HSBC, and Chintan Mehta, Group CIO at Wells Fargo, and my great colleague, Colin Gilbert, who heads up intelligence here at Evident, who will be moderating throughout the session. So before we dive into the results and the questions that we aim to cover in the next hour, I wondered if I could just pass and hand over to EJ and Chintan and to say a few words about what you do at HSBC and Wells Fargo, respectively. Over to you, EJ. Why don't you start?
Thank you. Privileged to be here. Thank you for having me. I lead the Office of Applied Artificial Intelligence at HSBC, and we have a threefold mission. 1, to build production-grade AI and generative AI products and capabilities. 2, to scale them across our 3 lines of businesses and functions across our 60-odd markets around the world. And 3, very much about workforce reskilling and transformation so that our teams around the world can reap the benefits of these products and capabilities, knowing how to do so responsibly, ethically, but also with the greatest productive gains in terms of customer experience and impact.
Thank you. And just freshly back from Hong Kong. Love to hear more about what was discussed out there. And over to you, Chintan. It was lovely, a pleasure to see you out in San Jose at the GTC conference, where we had a really lively chat on stage. But over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me. Even though it's early and I'm caffeinating as we go, so hopefully I'll make sense along the way. So yeah, I lead a group at Wells Fargo called Digital and Innovation. So essentially, this is all our in-market digital capabilities and experiences for Wells Fargo across all lines of businesses. And then the innovation piece is all the work that we do around experimentation and possible design of what is yet to be offered in terms of a customer offering. A subset of that is also a lot of the work that we do in the research space in AI, as well as in quantum computing and the convergence thereof. So essentially, the best way to visualize it is a time funnel, which is things in production, experiences, capabilities, including AI capabilities and platform products, and then research, which hopefully at some point becomes products for customers to use.
Yeah, that's great. It's so great to have you both. You're sitting in sort of the most important seats of the banks today. It's I can imagine you are extremely busy, and Chintan, thank you for getting up crack of dawn over there from the West Coast. But just before I hand over to Colin to guide some of the questions, I just wanted to sort of refresh on sort of where we are and what sort of where we are today. And here you can see the index that we produced back in November. That was our second iteration of the Evident AI Index. But actually, sort of now we're almost at the halfway mark. We are going to update the index again. As I said, it's on an annual basis. So the next update is in October. In the meantime, we're very busy tracking everything that happens across all of the pillars, of course. But today we're talking about the innovation pillar, as I said, where we're looking at research ventures and patents and partnerships and open source. But at this midway point, it's important for us also to pull back and take a look at what are the trends. A year is a long time in AI, and especially now, everything's accelerating beyond what we had imagined. Not only in AI, but actually also in quantum. There's been some really interesting announcements. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. but there's just things are going, going much faster than we had anticipated even just 6-9 months ago. So pulling back and viewing where we are in between index updates is ever more important. So what we do here in between is look at the fresh data. We review the trends. We look at the outliers because so much happens in between these updates. Sort of, are the leaders still the leaders? Who are the banks to watch? What are the changes that are happening in the banks? And there are a lot of changes that are happening in the banks. And we really aim to provide a snapshot of what's going on sort of today and what we're seeing from the data. We do that through our data track. We do that through the year, through our sort of tracking of data. And to that end, every month we publish. We look at specific sub-pillars in the index and publish fresh data on those sub-pillars every month. And we've been focusing in this quarter on innovation. And here you can see we've published on research, AI research in the banks. We published on the patent activity, and we published on ventures and partnerships. And that culminates in a full report on innovation that got released yesterday, which we're discussing today. Interestingly, innovation is probably our most popular of the pillar and arguably most contentious as well, because innovation is quite hard to define, and there's many ways to define it. And Colin had a look at the dictionary to come up with the point that is actually it is vague, and I'll let Colin make that point in a minute. But what we look at, and how we define innovation is in terms of 5 levers, and these are on the screen. You can see there. We look at research, so pure and applied AI research that banks aim to scale across the organization. Patents to protect strategic ideas. Ventures, which are strategic investments into AI companies to be used inside the banks to help accelerate AI adoption. And we look at partnerships. These are to help source, test, and develop new ideas in the bank. And we also look at open source ecosystems, which we measure and we sort of track that to see, how the AI community is tapping into a wider community outside the bank for discussions on AI development. So we believe that these 5 pillars represent what sort of innovation factors banks need to consider. And depending on the bank, of course, there are many pathways to success. You can build, you can borrow, you can buy. But this is something that we would like to sort of dive into, both from an overarching organizational perspective, but also from the perspective of the data that we are going to be taking a closer look at. But over to you, Colin.
Yeah, and again, thank you both to Chitin and EJ for joining us today. Alexandra alluded to definitions before, and I think that words have great power to such extremes that I think in a period of late 2022, early 2023, if you said AI innovation enough during an earnings call, you saw a halo effect on your equity performance for a little while. And if you look up innovation is defined as the act of innovating, which is not very helpful. And innovating is defined as just a new way of doing things, often through a new method or a new process or a new product. And so I'm really interested to ask you guys first, when you look at the evident framework for how we define innovation, how does that compare and contrast to your own bank's internal definition of innovation? What's consistent, what's missing, what, if anything, doesn't fit cleanly into one of these 5 boxes with such like a vague word. Chitin, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I was thinking when you mentioned that definition thing, because I think there is probably a plethora of working definitions, if you may, across multiple places, right? So the way I would break it down, at least the way we execute, is very relevant to the way the definition is formed up, which is seeking non-obvious insights, so first principles, generative research. That's one track. Ability to experiment based on those insights, and then ecosystems and structures and processes that allow you to actually take some of those kind of things to market and learn from it, whether it's feedback loops, improvements, or in some cases like sunsetting. That idea might have been great on paper but didn't survive. So if in that sort of a view of 3 different things, there's a cultural component to it, is, how diffuse is the ability to experiment, how many people can experiment at any given time, that drives scale of some of these things. So I would say, instead of going all over the place, I think it's the ability to find those non-obvious insights, the original thoughts, experimenting to prove or disprove it, and then the ability to take it to market. That would be a working definition of if you are innovating. And I don't think there is one group which can innovate. So you can't basically, or at any given point of time, you like innovate now is not a thing. You have to be constantly doing it. So yeah, I don't know if it helps, but that's the framing.
EJ, how does your work at HSBC compare or contrast with that working definition?
So I guess I would bring it back to, the idea of accelerating outcomes. And to me, the principal outcome here is how to better serve the customer, at a way that aligns to your organization's risk appetite and ultimately delivers the expected results. And the 5 things that you see here, okay, are critical ingredients. However, I would also say, particularly for us across, again, as I said before, our 60 market footprint, how we do what we do and where we do it is going to vary greatly. So for example, let's be very specific, patents, okay? Now in some parts of the world, okay, having that defensible IP is a very important ingredient or component to your go-to-market strategy for both product market fit and commercialization. In other parts of the world, particularly where there is a robust and mature open source ecosystem, okay, your barrier to entry, okay, may have very little to do with defensible IP. Your barrier to entry may be, how quickly can you have the right ecosystem of partners and research built upon open source capabilities that is far less dependent upon an IP-based mode. So I think what really has to happen here is take a step back, look at this through the lens of what is the outcome and where and for what purpose. And then depending upon what is going to deliver product market fit, for a given business process, for a given customer journey, for a given outcome, you're going to have to pick the right ingredients in your innovation mix, for lack of a better term, to deliver that. And if you're out of balance, you're basically manufacturing patents for patent's sake. You have partners that don't lead to outcomes. You have investments that don't, yield return. And you have research, candidly, that may not go anywhere other than great presentations and conferences. So you have to be crystal clear on what the expected outcomes are and balance it accordingly.
I think that's a wonderful transition actually to what we're trying to measure. And when we go through, each of these sub elements in detail, always bring it back to the challenge question of what is the missing link between doing X and getting outcome Y. So Alexandra, do you want to, I think that, especially when we look at the profiles of the leaders in innovation, it's just really interesting when you look at a heat map of their ranking, that it's kind of all over the map. And that's almost continuing EJ's point about what is right for one bank might not be right for something else. So more than anything, the innovation report gives us profiles of who is doing what configuration of things that is right to their market, their customer, and their strategy moving forward.
Yeah. And also I think, we'll just maybe at the end, but to go back to that point, EJ, that you're making around, it's got to be pointed, right? That research for research's sake and patents for patent's sake. So that sort of, how do you join that up in terms of identifying the problems and the use cases and making sure that all of the innovation resources are pointed to solve those, right? And there's a lot of discussion right now on that sort of centralization and decentralization, and how do you move at pace and get from ideation to production quickly with all of these levers. There's one thing is the innovation levers, the other one is there's obviously lots of others with talent and operational, structures and how that. Would love to get back to that. But just in terms of sort of getting us into the sort of meat of the data here, just starting off with just this slide of the overall rankings on the innovation pillar itself. And sort of what we see here is that the top 3 banks, so JP Morgan, Capital One, and RBC, are the same as in the overall ranking. this 7 of the top 10 banks also rank in the top 10 in the overall ranking. So just that sort of the strength and innovation sort of very much speaks to also the overall strength in the index. 9 of the top 10 are North American banks, but would say that the 10th slot is really tied between ING, HSBC, and BNP Paribas. So, and below the 10, there's this cluster of European banks, and we'll get back to the sort of the changes that we're seeing in the European banks. So that's just to give you a sort of a sense of where, you know, where the innovation ranks are, and what we see just sort of at the 10th mark and below. And then what we're going to be going into in the next couple of slides is that we're going to look at the data below this and research patterns and ventures, and look at what has changed, not changed. And then we'd love to, you know, we'll intersperse with questions for you, Chintan and EJ, but we'd also really love to hear questions from everyone on the call. So just pile into the chat and pose your questions, and we'll go to them as soon as we can. So over to you, Colin.
Yes, and just echoing that sentiment, really want this to be a blend of a download, an analyst download, and a discussion. So my main job is just to kick off the discussion, given the subject matter expertise that we have in the room today. So starting with research, this is what kind of the index and the data tells us in terms of what's happening in terms of incremental change since the last ranking. In 2023, we identified over 300 AI research papers published by the 50 banks in the index. And in the upper right-hand chart, you can basically see it's growing at a healthy 43% CAGR in this natural stair step in terms of expanding scholarship since 2018. But not all banks are contributing equally necessarily to that stair step. And a lot of the growth is driven by one institution, JP Morgan Chase, which, if the current trends persist, as you can see kind of their cumulative research output on the left-hand side of the slide, if that trend persists, they'll be in striking distance of actually producing over 50% of all net new AI research in 2024 compared to all the other banks that are publishing. That said, I think what's most interesting about the data is that when we look at the series of banks that are not JPMC and the banks that actually are experiencing, to a certain degree, a similar inflection point in 2022 as some of the earlier movers did in 2018 and 2019. And so I think this is a more important slide, is if you restrict the time horizon and just look at net change in research output in 2023 versus 2022, you have about a third of the banks that are decreasing the number of papers entering the ecosystem. You have about 40% that are just publishing what they publish at consistent levels, whether that's 1 paper or 3 papers or 10 papers. And then you have about a third of the index that is really doubling down on research. And not coincidentally, the guests that we have here today, their wider teams and colleagues, are responsible for the second and the third biggest uptick year over year in research output, with Wells Fargo and HSBC in the number 2 and the number 3 spots for basically that lift. And so, you know, gentlemen, my question to each of you is that, in your own words, you know, can you talk a little bit about the intrinsic value of research in the wider context of implementing a comprehensive AI strategy? How does this one sub-element connect with that wider definition that we kicked off the call with? Chintan, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can, and then obviously you know, EJ obviously add in. So I think to start off with, I think it's important that no bank, most likely, hopefully, is trying to actually change just the metrics on these rankings, right? So I think a lot of it is inherently a reflection of what's happening in the market conditions, or just the general development across the board on how much work that has to happen in this space. At least our experience on the research papers that we are working on is it's a combination of first is trying to drive the adoption curve of, in this example, AI for production use for specific outcomes that we have sort of deemed as important for our customers. And we are working through unsolved aspects of how to take it to market, how to scale it, how to keep it safe, how to make it reliable. And a lot of the research papers, if you see, fall in that sort of a space. Very small percentage is frontier in the sense of like a genuine next generation research around Feynman techniques or reservoir compute type models and things of that sort, which are like next generation of convergence with some other things. So I would say very important in that context, because again, if you index back to the things that we were just talking about, which is you are outcome driven, you have narrowed down that there are certain first principles that you have to sort of build on top of, right? You proved certain unanticipated insight, and then you're experimenting on top of it. These papers correlate to that. So that's a very, very important thing to consider. And to me, this is a reflection of the fact that a lot of us, all of us, to a large extent, are pushing pretty hard on trying to take some of these things, capabilities, technologies, solutions, and approaches to market. But you have to solve a bunch of things along the way. And when you solve it and you look around and you don't really find a lot of, comparative solutions available or scalable solutions available, that is when you publish a paper around it. So that's my experience with it, at least in the last 2 years.
And EJ,
I would
sorry, go ahead.
No, please go right ahead.
Well, please feel free to tack on to Chin's comment, but I did have a slightly different question for you as well, which is how much of like the numbers that that Evident is gathering don't come down to, intent or focus or resources as much as they do with people, specifically the PhDs that you're actively recruiting from academia and scholarship. And we had a very interesting conversation with Bing, featured here on this slide, who came over from Amazon to Goldman, I believe, last October. And so the general question is, do you think this feature that we're trying to capture, having a really active and robust research pipeline, is becoming the table stakes for attracting top-tier AI talent from across industry perspective? And that creates almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in the haves and have-nots as profiled here.
I would call it one of the many, again, table stakes and ingredients that we touched upon before. But, you have to look at this, as I think part of a much broader narrative. So I want to build upon a few things that Chintan said. So number one, there's quite literally, from a sector perspective, banking and financial services has the potential, okay, to apply this in a way responsibly and ethically to just create incredible value for customers and shareholders. Number one. Number two, the fact that this can and should be used as a magnet for world-class talent to apply that talent towards solving real-world problems, okay, is not lost on many within the research community. Many, not all, but many, I think, would like to see, their hard work and effort into these kind of frontier spaces actually applied, for the benefit of community, whether small businesses, commercial corporate banking, or retail customers. This is an area where that connection between what you do and your thought leadership really matters beyond the publication of a paper. The final thing I would say is that in some respects, this is about a shared opportunity and a shared outcome, across the banks. We have a responsibility as an industry to get this right, okay? I think I can speak safely for Chintan and he for I, that, if we all do this right together as an industry, okay, it's a positive reflection on how we think about innovation, how we think about serving our customers, how well we are from our key regulators. And by doing this and having world-class research as part of that, you're basically, making a better case that you are capable of innovating, that you can do so in terms of advanced products. Because I think others are going to rightly ask, whether it's a customer or candidly, again, a regulator, if you aren't thinking about innovation, if you aren't thinking about research, how do you expect to serve your customers in the future? And if you can't answer that, then I think it's really going to call into question, your ability to provide not just in terms of the opportunities for new products, but also candidly to protect them against the emerging risks that are coming from bad actors, who will be equally using this technology for fraud, anti-money laundering, et cetera. So we also have that obligation to get this right as well to protect our customers.
I was going to add one quick point on this. I think, Colin, to your question, more than the count of the paper, the areas of what the papers are representing or the
Yes.
work that those papers are pushing towards are a stronger attraction for talent, especially if it correlates very strongly to their interest areas and things that they believe they want to spend time on. So I think there's a component of like discovery, which is where the numbers come in, like, hey, who's doing research? There's definitely a numbers thing there. But once you unpack that a little bit, I think the topics, the areas in which there's pushing happening. And to EJ's point, I think it's 100% valid, which is like, as a culture, are you willing to push the boundary? This represents that you're willing to push the boundary on hard problems, unknown areas. So I think that's a correlation.
And I think that, sorry, go ahead, Alexandra.
No, I was just trying to, I would love to get your views on the point that was brought up before in terms of that. Yeah, the areas I think is a very good point, but also pointing it to the actual problems that you're seeking to solve within the lines of business. One of the research leaders of the research hubs in another bank that we were talking to said, what we try to do of all of the research, roughly, 70% goes to solving problems that have been brought to us. So we sort of use the research to do that. And then, the rest, the remaining 30% is sort of split between looking at the sort of the horizon in terms of, can we try to anticipate what we might need in 2 to 3 years? So 15 to 20% of the research on that, and the rest is blue sky. To your point, EJ, on sort of, we need to also prove that we are an innovative organization. That blue sky, there is room for that blue sky research. But the question was sort of, how do you, what are the mechanisms with which, where you sort of say, okay, here's the problem, let's get our researchers on it? Is it back to the question of, is that then a centralized question, or is it that, do you identify the problems in the line of business and then bring it over? How does that work at Wells Fargo versus how are you thinking about it at HSBC?
Go EJ, go first. Go for it, EJ.
So, for us, I don't know if the percentages are largely accurate, but, let's kind of give some give or take. We have the obligation to really think in a way that, how do we best serve our customers, and again, those 60-odd markets. Now, let's be very precise. There are certain things that are just going to be so blue sky, okay, that while we do need to kind of give it its space, the predominance of what we have to do is through the, the medium term to kind of, from a pipeline perspective, bring this research in to better serve and better protect our customers, full stop, okay? And, how that works, we have an incredible team in the organization actually called Innovation and Partnerships, led by a great leader, Ian Glasner. And so Ian, by design, as amongst our most senior leaders in the organization, works across all businesses and functions. Because if you do this in a way that is so fundamentally siloed by business, by function, by geography, you will miss out on the scale of the outcome necessary to solve for the organization. And then the hard responsibility kind of then rests with the product teams and a group of world-class product owners who can make that constant bridge between the applied research and how to take that back into their product to stay 1, 2, 3 steps ahead, to make sure that the customer is served and protected. And it's that close connection between, the product teams and the product owners and the research teams is where the magic happens. And if that, a gap exists, then basically you have innovation that's unhinged from product, and you have product that's really falling behind. So you have to bring those together in a way aligned to your OKRs, and ultimately that's how you have to do it in opinion.
Yeah, yeah. Before going to Chindan, just one more question for you, EJ, on that. I mean, you do operate in a lot of markets. Does that make the way that you think about organizing applied research to solve these problems, right? Does that cause an additional challenge, or is research something specifically not impacted by operating in that many markets?
I mean, it certainly makes it more fun. I would say, go back to those ingredients of partners, ecosystems, patents, research. One of the things that we have is just a range of world-class university partnerships. And that is by design, geographically dispersed, because we need to have, federated knowledge, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in South Asia, whether it's in the Americas, and bringing that richness of understanding and that depth and breadth of that knowledge into the organization is paramount for us to kind of get it right. So where we choose to invest, where we choose to partner, the ecosystems that we create, in order to have that, ultimately that product market fit, whether it's in India, whether it's in any other part of the world, right? It's going to rely on that local knowledge. And so our innovation kind of and research agenda has to contemplate a global footprint by design.
And maybe one more question to give to Chintan as well is that there's a good question coming in, I believe from Sean O'Dowd in the chat channel right now, which is what thoughts can be shared about how we go about figuring out what outcomes are feasible. What does that process look like? And I think it's connected to this topic, because what I'm hearing is that when you line up the research agenda, the product agenda, the customer priorities, there needs to be an exercise where you go through what is feasible in delivering ROI now versus later, which doesn't necessarily happen as much in academia, where there's less of that pressure in terms of a time scale. So related to the same conversation we're having, I'm curious organizationally or by process or policy, how all the different stakeholders in the bank get in a room and actually agree on what are the consistent KPIs that everybody are working towards from very different perspectives and very different incentives.
Yeah, I'll try to connect the threads on in these 2-3 things. So I think the approach that we have taken, and again, this is not a movie that has played out completely, but for what it's worth, it's been reasonably working out for us so far, is a combination of sourcing ideas from anywhere and everywhere, filtering them and taking them through an experimentation and sort of a research process, which is cross-discipline, but still controlled centrally or orchestrated centrally, not controlled, orchestrated centrally. So like a lot of my teams, a couple of my peers, we do a lot of that sort of hand-holding of research. And the group that actually does a lot of that work is a combination of people who sit inside lines of businesses, have subject matter expertise, may have a closer understanding of the problem space, but then you apply technology, new design thinking, things of that sort to sort of bring a shape to it, structure to it, and then you can experiment on top of it. Whether it could be in market alphas or you could do something more controlled around it. Now, the framework that we use for doing a lot of this filtering is essentially a more standardized framework across the board, which when I was at Stanford, everybody would say every course that you take at Stanford is a design thinking course, but it's essentially called DVF, which is desirability, viability, and feasibility of any idea, right? And there is a degree of subjectivity to it, but then when you actually have a group of people, strong stakeholders, do that DVF filtering at different stages, not just initially and then never revisit it. So initially, just when you're intaking that concept or like an idea or a notion, you do degree of DVF against it, saying if it were to succeed, what's the economic viability of it? Is that even feasible engineering wise or just market conditions wise? And then would it be desirable as a way of sort of framing it? Now, this is traditional product development. It is not pure research, so to speak. So if you parse out if DVF is applied to, as you Colin was starting to point out, like there is a reason why academia does not apply DVF. Because if they start applying DVF, 99.9% of the stuff they will have to stop because there's no clear outcome that they can drive towards. So you have to have some room for that blue sky piece, Alexander, as you were describing. But barring that, this framework allows you to filter at different stages as you build more understanding of like desirabilities, viabilities, and feasibilities. And then at the end of the day, it's also not a concept where like a few people, there's a concept called HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion doesn't play out. You do an experiment. You actually do put it in front of eventually users, paying customers, hopefully, who use it and then can give a reaction against it, and then you take it through the iterative graduation as you go. So there's a lot of science to it. There are many different paths. This is not the only path. We use DVF, and it's been working out reasonably well so far.
Excellent. I think in the interest of time, I want to move on to kind of the next subsegment, and chat's blowing up with questions. So I'll try to feed in more of those into our dialogue. So patents, I'm really excited to talk about because EJ kind of threw down the gauntlet and stole a little bit of our thunder in the introduction. But very briefly, this is where the geographic bias for the North American banks really comes from. And what we see, again, as with research, is extreme bifurcation in the data. Over a very long time horizon, you see Capital One and Bank of America responsible for 72% of AI patents. And in the last 12 months of available data, since the data from intellectual property offices is lagged 18 months by design, they account for about 66% of those filings. But what's interesting to us about the data is not who's ahead or behind, it's like what that data tells us in terms of potential use cases. And as you move across this graph from left to right, what you begin to see is the focus of patent applications shifting. And those categories shaded in orange are the ones that are really accelerating in more recent years. We're seeing more use cases in patent filings focused on compliance, recommendation systems, anti-money laundering, and know your customer. And we think there's a bridge there to early experiments with Gen AI as they relate to co-pilots, as they relate to customer acquisition, and as they relate to fraud applications, respectively. So I'm going to start with EJ. Your colleague David Rice talked at Symposium very eloquently about the pace of disruption coupled with the complexity of operating in 62 markets. And I think you would agree, but I wanted you to expand upon it. Do you think kind of the global complexity of a given bank's operations undermines the utility of patents? Put another way, I think HSBC is catering to about 40 million customers across 62 markets, and Wells Fargo is catering to roughly 70 million across 35 markets. Is your job just a lot harder than Chitin's at the end of the day?
I would never suggest that.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. It is harder. You get it, EJ. You win this.
You're too kind.
You asked that question, Colin.
You're too kind. I would say this. I am a multi-patent holder at Bank of America. Okay, I understand from my my prior nearly 15 years there the importance that it's placed there, and that makes a lot of sense. Okay, that said, okay, my present perspective, I think, is different now because of what's going on again in open source, what's happened in the last few years in terms of the barrier to entry to production, contrasting this with, again, banking is not healthcare, but at the same time, the barrier to entry in healthcare of running the gauntlet, in terms of the FDA and the EU to get, a pharmaceutical into production, that's years and years and billions of dollars. That's no longer the case, or not even haven't been the case in banking and financial services. So, patents and IP protection are absolutely an important part of the ecosystem. But at the end of the day, if the exam question is the acceleration of customer, shareholder, and regulatory outcomes, okay, it has to be done in balance. And at the end of the day, again, to repeat myself, I really question, because of the pace of innovation, an over-indexed importance in this particular area, particularly, and again, the Californian in me is very proud of the fact, that it's the world's, fourth or fifth biggest economy. Okay. At the same time, your average corporate and institutional client banks in 20, 30, 40, 50 markets. Okay. A patent portfolio that is wonderful in the United States doesn't necessarily help me solve, from a solution perspective, a great customer journey or business process for every market that they're in. So is it helpful? Yes. But is it going to be dispositive to get the result and the outcome I want? Not necessarily, not anymore. That's my personal perspective.
Yeah.
All right.
By the way, I
And
don't disagree with that. I'll add to that. I think our initiation vector for thinking more about patents intentionally has been a little bit of the litigious nature of things that happen
Yeah.
in. I think there is a reason why the top banks in patent spaces are in North America because of just that notion of orthogonal outbound in sort of claims around you using somebody else's thing and all those kind of things. It helps you protect to a certain extent. It does not solve all the problems. It also, in general, this is Chintan's opinion, the Californian and me is coming back out as like patents don't necessarily help innovation.
Yeah.
They try to create walled gardens in the longer run. Now, sometimes it's okay because there's a timing component to it. But in general, these are meant more as defensive mechanisms than they are representative of any sort of cutting edge research, just to be very honest.
This is a really important point that he's making that I agree with. And in some respects, allow me to be slightly contrarian and controversial. There is a possibility that if you build your solution architecture around your IP, in some respects, it's an anti-pattern to innovation because you're locking yourself in to your effectively the patent portfolio that you have built, right, and your own moat, as opposed to being more expansive, more able to kind of tap into open source, more able to tap into other kind of investment in ecosystems. I don't know if the data will prove that out. That's a hypothesis on my point, but we might get to a point where a patent portfolio locks you in and actually it becomes an anti-pattern, to true like rapid innovation.
the numbers are stark with only about 22 of the banks in the index file patents. 18 of those are North American. 90% of the filings are USA banks. I guess two follow-up questions, one coming and two of these coming from chat, is one, going back to Chintan's point, is this as much just about legal and cultural factors on opposite sides of the ponds, opposite sides of the pond that, Americans, for better or worse, patent first and fight it out in courts later, and Europeans have a more optimistic view of the regulatory environment to prevent egregious abuses of IP infringement, et cetera? Or is it just a wider history of it going back to the post-war period?
My take is I think all of those could be true at the same time. I mean, I don't think there's a single causation to it, but the fact that there is such a high skew towards a certain geography being in that bucket is indicative of something geographic in nature, which the only thing I can think of is that notion of being protective or being a little bit more defensive. Because we and EJ in his past life, I'm sure, has seen that too, and some of our peers who you see are very high. We have been subject to some very sort of grinding battles around some of the stuff, and in things that you would be surprised with, which is like, really? But yeah.
And a good question from Berto Mill in chat was actually related back to the research capabilities, but I want to kind of phrase it in this context, is that his question was, is AI research being published exclusively by masters and PhD researchers at the bank? My question is, are similar profiles the core of what people call your innovation base for the people credited on the patents, even though they're assigned to the banks? Can those patent ideas come from anywhere, or do they come from a similar place of advanced kind of academic credentialing?
I mean, they can come from anywhere, but the paper writing process, especially depending on the peer review process, that we go through, or like final publication to archive and things like that, that does tend to have a very academic skew to it, the way it is presented, the way it is formulated, the way it is written. So there is a strong correlation of people who have history of publishing papers being involved with paper publication. But the ideas themselves originate everywhere. So yeah, it's not constrained to like somebody who has a master's in comp science or math or a PhD in any of these areas being the only people who come up with these things.
Cool. Alexandra, any final questions on this front before
Yeah.
we move into ventures for the last 10 minutes?
Lots. I think EJ has just argued for us to scrap the patent sub.
Balance.
I object. No, it's a really good point. I think, I mean, it's really interesting. And I think something for us to sort of keep an eye on going forward is the question of, do you lock yourself into your, what you do based on your patent library, and what does that mean for your product? I think that's one sort of quick question before we sort of go into the next section, and conscious of time too, but I mean, a lot of the discussions we have with the banks right now, of course, is sort of this being able to bring on board generative AI tools for, Gen AI use cases at pace, and keep up with the pace of development at the same time. And I'm wondering, when I'm sort of listening to this and listening to your great comments, also how, for you to be, what are the factors, and what role does sort of a well-stocked and high level or proportion of researchers and research in a bank equip you with that ability to react quickly to the changes on the front end? I know there are many components that go into that, but I just wondered if you had reflections.
For me, having that embedded research capability into, for example, the team that we have at the Office of Applied AI has been instrumental in speed to market. And while there will be no product announcements here on this call, I can tell you that having that extremely close relationship between your product ownership and technology teams with the researchers who are on that leading edge, that is absolutely a positive multiplier effect, because you're now combining the best of that research, applying it into product, and then immediately bringing that into your pipeline, particularly when it comes to key aspects such as model risk management, model assessment, governance, and being able to kind of constantly, improve that as part effectively as your agile delivery method. So if you really rethink, research as the leading edge of your agile delivery, as opposed to this thing that's exclusively over there, it can absolutely be a positive multiplier for your product teams.
Yep. I'll anecdotally add a context to it, which is like a lot of the work, and this is probably true for everybody. But like, so translating one of the hurdles of taking frontier research from, say, the work that we do with Stanford Human-Centered AI, or with MIT on some of the things that we're working on, is translating and industrializing it from that research state into something that you can then sort of do some pilots around and then eventually take it into market. I think having a very close sort of ability to operate in sort of a co-creation mode in that setting early on is genuinely very helpful and accelerating through the pipeline, as EJ is describing it, which is you take a very, very dense, and not in a bad way, but like impactful research, which is still reasonably abstract, making it contextual to the institution and the market that you're operating in, and then sort of translating it into a product pipeline. That is where the research component, where you have that sort of high density capability, can accelerate you very quickly from like concept to production all the way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's just one comment there's one quick question maybe before we go on, from B. Smith. How is the banking industry navigating the black box of neural networks? So just before we go into ventures, I don't know if anyone, Chintan, if you want to respond to that.
I'll jump in. I mean, there's a little bit of a through line that I think I would like to draw. The traditional statistical approach to a lot of these things, you could build inherently interpretable models. And so we index very heavily in traditional AI we open sourced a platform called PIML, Python for Interpretable Machine Learning, which has a bunch of algorithms that we built over a long period of time, which are inherently interpretable. These are better than post hoc techniques like LIME or SHAP values and things of that sort. But if you extrapolate that into generative spaces of especially large language models, and more importantly, foundational models, which are pre-trained somewhere outside potentially your ecosystem, you end up being very heavily indexed on post hoc techniques, which are not considered generally as effective as inherently interpretable components. So what we have done is we have developed a sort of a risk assessment framework, but then also a lot of protection around use cases. The way I would call out that shift is protecting the model versus protecting the use case, or guarding the use case, or make the use case safe. And that's a lot of work that we have done over the last 2 years to 18 months to build those kind of automation capabilities, telemetry, where you can actually understand much better how the interactions are happening, regardless of the underlying LLM or a multimodal model, and not over-index on protecting just the model itself from doing certain things, right? Because the larger these become, the harder that becomes, and they're more opaque, not necessarily in a intention to harm, but they just become more opaque. That requires that degree of density to it. And so that's the approach we have taken so far. And yeah, it's been working, but we'll have to come up with better approach, which is where a lot of the research that we're doing is happening as well.
Yeah. EJ, do you want to jump in on that one?
Very well said. I actually have nothing else to add. It was perfectly stated.
So back to you, Colin.
All right. So 5 quick minutes on venture, and then we'll go into wrap up. I think that when we look at the venture data, it's been a very ugly 2 years in the wider venture capitalist markets, and that down cycle kind of finally spilled over to the bank deal flow. As of 2023, deal flow is down about 37% across the 50 index banks, at least those with venture arm activities. But we saw a really interesting, nugget within this data set, was that the more that the deal flow fell off, the more Europe and the UK's share of the remaining deal flow actually increased. And so the top right chart is basically all of the AI-specific external investments by kind of the top 10 banks over the last decade plus. And then the bottom right chart, is basically just constrained to 2023. And you can see the geographic diversification that we don't see in patents happening in full force here. So my question to EJ was, regarding the shift in deal flow from HSBC's perspective, do you view this as proof positive or an early sign of the successful globalization of AI startups beyond that AI under the right conditions can happen anywhere beyond the typical incubators and industrial park models that have really biased previous waves of technology?
So a few things. I've said the term barriers to entry, a few times. I'm gonna say it again here. Okay. If you are, through your Series A, Series B, first of all, where does a given bank tend to invest and at what level? Okay. And second, what else is out there that allows me to get to market faster, enterprise grade at scale? Okay. This is not a new challenge. Okay. So, if you are Series A, B, leaning, further on from that, can you operate at our scale and at our pace, and work, well within our stack? I cite before, open source, what's going on in other ecosystems, and kind of the mature technology, companies that, don't need to be named here, but that you can imagine, that are already bringing to market a range of capabilities that will take years to commercialize to their fullest extent, So there are very specific areas, in the startup economy that will help solve problems at scale, but they are very targeted and very specific. I would also say from our perspective, we have as a much focus on Asia, clearly, in some cases more so, than anywhere else. And so we have to focus on data localization in key markets, and unless a lot of these, startup, players can understand how to support us everywhere from China to India to Saudi Arabia to the United States to United Kingdom, it becomes, very, very difficult. Now, where you do have a company that, is likely to have product market fit or grow into that, certainly that's an area where we're going to have, active investment. But I would say it's much more targeted. And, again, the barriers to entry, I would end with, are increasingly lower and lower, which means that if you're going to come to market and you're going through Series B, you're going to have to really be able to differentiate yourself, in a way that brings those barriers to entry down even further.
Yeah. And a slightly different question for Chintan is that if you think, there's a very good quote from Vibor from City Ventures up on the slide right now, where he talks a lot about acquiring capabilities versus companies. Through that lens, I'm interested in going back to our original question, is how different stakeholders get in a room and agree on KPIs. I'm interested in your perspective at Wells Fargo of how much venture activity is at arm's length versus densely integrated with the technical roadmap, the digital transformation roadmap, the AI transformation roadmap on your side of the house. How do you communicate over that wall?
Yeah, so it is at arm's length to a large extent by design, because you don't necessarily want to skew yourself to things that are relevant to you when it comes to investment. I think it's very important. Like, the AI ventures are meant to be an activity of a very different, or not AI ventures, but generally ventures are meant to be an activity of value by themselves.
Yeah.
We do have a very active sort of process where, when something is being discussed, digital, AI, and a few other things do become a part of that sort of conversation, saying how relevant is it to us? How much of a engagement do we need in the longer term, whether it's for using or sort of co-creating with them and things of that sort. And there's a dedicated group, a partnerships group, which works on that. But I think the piece that I think EJ was calling out is that entry barriers are low, but scalability barriers are high. So I think if you juxtapose those two things, which is like, you can build an amazing demonstrator, and increasingly it'll become easier to prove that, hey, I can build something which is nice and fits exceptionally well. But it is going to be very hard for that sort of a thing to perpetually scale to the needs of institutions of the size that we are operating with. Not just in terms of technology, but in terms of like what hurdles are to be cleared from a process standpoint, regulatory, legal compliance, and so on and so forth. And so those are the kind of things that we're trying to help some of these companies with. So once we start engaging, it is, yes, about the technology capability, but then it's also the capability to actually bring that thing to a scale where you're not sort of eliminated in the first round, because you don't have the experience or the ability to take it through all these complicated processes that most financial institutions have to live with in any market. So I think it's important to not ignore that. Those tend to become actually the reason why you don't do things even when the product is awesome. It may not be something that you use because of the other barriers around it. And so we help with that as well. So we engage in that context a little bit aggressively.
Cool. Well, we're rapidly approaching the top of the hour. I'll throw in one bonus question from the audience, which I think is a great one to potentially conclude on. Olaf Lockman asks, with innovation at the forefront, what are some examples or areas of AI that are being applied in the organization? And how far is this leveraging third-party capabilities versus developed or internal capabilities? I think that's tied to the venture discussion, is what is essential for the bank to own and develop itself versus what can it go borrow and buy, especially potentially in the Gen AI realm, that really creates kind of that dividing line for strategic decision making.
Yep. Well, I'll go. So we launched Fargo about 2 years ago, and it's not a product announcement, so it's already out there. People are using it, and we built it. We co-created a lot of that the capability there with Google when we sort of built the initial language model capabilities through it, and then scaled beyond that with Vertex and so forth. The way I would break it down, at least there's a very clear sort of preconditions that have been met. Like, foundational models don't make a lot of economic sense unless they're built in a way where multiple different people can use it. So anybody in our seat, or at least in my seat, thinking that, okay, I'm going to build a foundational model ground up, it's just economically impractical to try something like that. I mean, you can, but it's not that you should, right? So that is where one very clear case where you have to partner, you should partner. It makes a lot of sense. The second place where a lot of ecosystem plays out is the end-to-end pipeline. This has been a quote in data science for a very long time. Model development is 15% of the problem. The remaining 85% is how do you productionize it? How do you take it through the pipeline? How do you do the sort of the challengers? How do you prove it? That is where a big ecosystem of tools, techniques, different providers, all of them play together. And also one of those ones where you should not fall in love with any tool that you develop to solve a problem today, because the next version of it might come from outside. And so that is where an ecosystem sort of plays out very actively. And then finally, you are on hook for the outcome, right? So at the end of the day, you can say all these things, you can use the most shiny tools, but if you don't build it and take it to market, it doesn't really mean much. And so I would say that is where you own it, that last mile of taking it to the market. You own your customer's experience, you own your customer's outcome. And so that one you don't outsource ever, or partner, maybe in some cases. But these other two places that I'm describing, I think that is an ecosystem play for sure.
I think that's a great synthesis. Anything, EJ, to add? Final word?
Just very briefly, everything Chintan said, I would also say to get the true economic benefit and outcome from this, you have to abstract this at a level much higher than a discrete use case. You have to think about your risk appetite and patterns and be able to provide ultimately your customers and certainly your teammates with wide-ranging platforms, with robust and automated control frameworks, because there's no greater connection than those teammates have direct to customer. And if you give them the tools and you give them the products and you wrap the right governance and control framework around them, they will build beautiful customer journeys and processes. And that really should be a guiding principle.
Thanks. So Alexandra, back to you. Gentlemen, I learned so much over the course of the last hour, and I'm sure our audience feels the same. So just a huge thank you for your time and your expertise. Alexandra, all you.
No, thank you so much, Chintan and EJ, for joining us. Giants in your space, as I started out saying, and listening to your wise comments on this and reacting to the fresh data and hearing what's on your mind has been terrific. So thank you so much for participating. And also thank you to, there's been unbelievably good and many questions in the chat. I'm just trying to think through how we can capture them. We will have them, of course. If anyone's interested, let us know. And up next is our series on talent. So we're going to be looking at talent capabilities across the banks and all of the fresh data there and development, which will ladder up into a full talent report. But the dispatches next couple of months will be on talent. And if you haven't signed up to our newsletter, The Brief, please do. It's a bi-weekly newsletter that sort of captures all of the activities that are going on in the banks on hires and announcements, but also fresh data from the index that we feature in the brief. But thank you everyone for joining. Sorry we ran over by a couple of minutes. Brilliant to see you all, and have a nice day.